Good evening, and welcome to everyone attending our webinar entitled Tackling Long COVID Together. We have a great turnout of over 250 people, which is reflective of the real problems that are out there due to the prolonged effects of COVID-19. My name is Paul Ross, and I am Director of APC Microbiome Ireland, the organisation hosting this evening's event. We are a world-leading Science Foundation Ireland research centre based at University College Cork and at Teagasc Moore Park. And we are Ireland's National Institute for Microbiome Research with a team of over 300 researchers. The microbiome is not a familiar term for everyone listening, I know, so I'll give a little explanation about our work. Each one of us is home to trillions, in fact, about 100 trillion of microorganisms, including bacteria and viruses that live on and in our body, but mainly in the gut. In the last 2 decades, we've come to realize the influence that these communities of bacteria have on our health and how they may be influenced by the food we eat, our lifestyle, and the medicine and medication that we take during our lives. Our microbiome is intrinsically linked to our health and also influences our susceptibility to disease and infection, which explains our interest in the pandemic, which has been caused by COVID. The last few months have highlighted how important it is for countries to have an agile cohort of researchers so that we can mobilize quickly in response to emergencies such as this. The pandemic response projects taking place at APC Microbiome Ireland include a project called COVID Biome, which is a study examining changes in the gut microbiome of people who have contracted the infection, and it's led by Professors Colin Hill and Paul O'Toole. Another interesting study is the CORAL study, examining how COVID-19 has impacted on early life microbiome and immune development. And it's led by Liam O'Mahony, who's going to talk later, and Professor Jonathan Horgan in the Royal College of Surgeons. The Irish Coronavirus Sequencing Consortium, led by Paul Cotter at Teagasc Moore Park, has played a huge part in sequencing and tracking new viral variants, such as the Delta variant in Ireland, helping the national pandemic response rollout. Another project led by John McSherry has been leading a project focused on the detection and diagnosis of COVID-19 in saliva, which would allow for more easier and rapid testing of the virus. And lastly, a project between Liam O'Mahony, Professor Liam O'Mahony, and Dr. Karina Sadlier, who's also going to talk, have been looking at the cytokine storm, or the excessive inflammation that occurs in hospitalized patients with COVID-19. Also, they'll be examining the longer-term immune consequences in COVID patients 6 to 9 months following hospitalization. Both are on this panel tonight and can tell you more about this very exciting research. We at APC Microbiome Ireland continue to actively support research, education, and interventions in people suffering from active COVID-19 disease and to those who have long-term complications from the infection. And finally tonight, we're delighted to launch a survey which will aid in expanding our understanding of the experience of COVID-19 and COVID in Ireland. Findings from the study may help planning for services, care pathways, and supports for patients affected by COVID-19 in Ireland. A link to the survey will be emailed to delegates at the end of the event and available from 7:30 on apc.ucc.ie. I thank you again for joining us here this evening and hope the event is beneficial to you. And I'll now hand you over to Professor Mary Horgan, who's President of the Royal College of Physicians, a member of NPHET, and a faculty member at APC, who will now chair the webinar. So, hi Mary.
Hi Paul, thank you very much for the invitation to chair the meeting. Very warm welcome to all of the attendees. Just to note that the session is being recorded and Many of you have submitted questions already, which we will attend to towards the end of the meeting, but we're very keen that we receive more questions, and you can do that in the chat function. I suppose I'm an infectious disease physician for more years than I care to remember, 30 years at this stage. I did my training in the US and took up a role in CUH over 20 years ago. And I suppose during my training, both as a medical student and practicing infectious diseases, there were many infectious diseases discovered, including HIV, hepatitis C, more recently SARS-CoV-1, which was the original SARS, SARS-CoV-2, swine flu. The list goes on. And what really has proven essential to getting us to where we are, whether it's with COVID or with other infectious diseases, is the scientific knowledge that really is based on research. And we've seen that most recently with the development of vaccination and indeed treatments that we can use for frontline care of patients. So that important critical thinking, research, analysis, learning from our experience is absolutely essential to our understanding of not only the short-term effects that SARS-CoV-2 has on us, but also the long-term effects of the infection, which causes the disease COVID-19. And that's the purpose of the meeting. It's always really important to hear the voice of the patient and those impacted either directly or indirectly by infection, because that informs the direction of our research. So really looking forward to the discussion tonight, and I'm going to hand you over to Philip Boucher-Hayes, who will facilitate the discussion. Thank you, Paul, and over to you, Philip.
That's gas. The very first thing that I said to all of the panelists was make sure you don't leave your mute button on when you need to start speaking. Mary, thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for having me. Inviting me to what I think is going to be an absolutely fascinating and illuminating conversation. We have on this panel researchers, practitioners, clinicians, and sufferers of long COVID, and I would hope that after about an hour or so, we will have the bones of an outline to 4 key questions here. First off, what is long COVID? Why is it that I might get long COVID and somebody else wouldn't? What are the best treatments for this? And how do we best support sufferers and support those who are trying to treat sufferers? The panel includes in no particular order, a professor of immunology, a man who is the principal investigator in APC Microbiome Ireland in UCC, professor of immunology, Liam O'Mahony. And Paul has already referred to this. Liam has some early days research that is absolutely fascinating on the role of the possible role of the immune system and how it might play a role in how some people get long COVID and others don't. That's research that he was assisted in by Dr. Karina Sadlier, who is at the sharp end of treating COVID patients. She's a consultant in infectious diseases at Cork University Hospital, also a member of NIAC, so she will have a good reading of the most up-to-date information on the impact of vaccinations on COVID patients. We're also joined, I'm pleased to say, by Tanya Buwalda, who is a long COVID sufferer, one of the people who is behind the Long COVID Ireland support group. So she will have plenty of insight into what it is that patients need, hopefully. And also by Dr. Nuala O'Connor, who is at, I suppose, the even more pointy end of dealing with long COVID than Karina Sadlier, because she's the national lead for COVID-19, representing the Irish College of General Practitioners here this evening. So translating Liam and Karina's research into treatments that actually help people like Tanya and others. That first question that I said that we hope to answer during the course of this debate might sound a little bit obtuse because we all think that we know what long COVID actually is. But it's the first thing that I want to get everybody to chip in on, please, is a working definition of what long COVID is, because we're talking about conditions that encompasses everybody from the person who has come out of 3 weeks lying face down in medicated coma in intensive care to the person with a bit of brain fog who walks into a room and can't remember why it is that they're actually there. So Liam, let me get you to address that first, please. Is the term long COVID unhelpfully broad?
Yeah, thank you, Philip. I think actually at the beginning, it was very useful and impactful to group everybody together so that we could see actually and realize the magnitude of basically the long-term and the unexpected effects actually of this single virus. But I think, as you alluded to, now that we're realizing that not everyone who gets long COVID does so for the same reasons, I think it would be important to make those distinctions between those, as you said, those who perhaps have lung scarring due to a very serious infection, versus those who maybe have had a relatively milder infection, but they have a very severe fatigue. So their care, the research around them, etc., will be very, very different.
Tanya, do you want to weigh in on this, please, from your point of view and the people that have joined your support group? Just describe the range of conditions that you're dealing with.
We don't have enough time tonight, Philip, to go through all of these, but I'll give you a kind of a extreme from one to the other with a few sprinkled in between. Broadly speaking, you can kind of group them into things like respiratory symptoms. So chest pressure, lacking in air. I'm air hungry tonight quite a lot, probably something to do with nerves. So there's a whole respiratory set. There's a digestive set of systems. You might have your whole system up in arms, and you can't eat food. You're becoming reactive to things that you never were reactive before. You might have diarrhea and things like that. You then have kind of neurological symptoms where people have the brain fog, but they also have sometimes tremors, shakes, neurological like pulses through their body, kind of like little electricity pulses. The chronic fatigue often is the one thing that a lot, I would say a vast majority of us with long COVID seem to have, whether we have a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B, there seems to be a thread along with the fatigue. But you've got everything. I mean, you've got heart palpitations, lung issues, the list. I mean, I think there's about 100, 120 symptoms now that have been globally recognized to do with long COVID. So it's pretty broad.
From your point of view, then, is the term long COVID unhelpfully broad?
From the patient's perspective, I don't think so, because as a group, it's a nice umbrella to advocate under. I think if you maybe broke it out into symptom groups, we may not get listened to as much as maybe we should. So from just a patient advocacy point of view, I think it's helpful to us to have long COVID. I think from a science point of view, perhaps it might be more useful to have it kind of into symptoms. But again, every organism is different, every person is different. And my experience is completely different to someone else's. And I might be a mainly respiratory person, but with a little bit of neurological. So even then, you don't fit into the nice little neat descriptions. This is the one thing that's facing, I think, us as a patient group and also the wider medical and scientific community. It is a whole system illness. And so we have to think of it as in a more comprehensive, more rounded way.
From a political point of view, from a public relations point of view, absolutely. If you have a term that has captured the public imagination in the way that long COVID has, you would be ill-advised to dispose of it. But I wonder, Karina, from your point of view, as a clinician, does that term, again, become unhelpful when you're trying to identify the prevalence of different conditions?
I suppose it does bring with it some challenges. As Tanya said, Philip, it's very much an umbrella term. From a clinical perspective, there isn't an agreed or consensus definition. There isn't a diagnostic criteria for long COVID, and there's no single diagnostic test for the condition. It's really broadly considered, a failure in a patient for the symptoms that they have to improve persistence of symptoms or development of new symptoms beyond 12 weeks now is thought to be the cutoff. So beyond 12 weeks, if symptoms are persisting, that's being described as long COVID. And from a clinical perspective, we're beginning to see two clinical groups of patients. The first group is the group who had severe COVID initially, required hospitalization or critical care. And the second group then is patients who had very mild initial illnesses. You know, so some patients may even have been asymptomatic to begin with, and then they developed new symptoms, debilitating fatigue, brain fog, difficulties with shortness of breath. So, you know, I suppose as we're all saying, the numbers of symptoms are very broad. You know, the time cutoff is variable in terms of describing the condition. So from a medical perspective, it does, and from a research perspective, there are challenges in terms of, as you said, measuring prevalence, in terms of, you know, giving patients prognosis. The pattern of recovery can be very different in these groups that we're seeing.
Nuala, from your point of view, do you treat patients who come into you as sufferers of long COVID, or do you just treat a respiratory condition, a pulmonary condition, or whatever?
I treat patients, actually. So I think the most important thing, I think sometimes we can get bogged down in terminology and in symptom complexes. At the end of the day, there's a patient in front of me who's feeling unwell, and they may or may not have had a history of COVID, and they are experiencing symptoms, many of the symptoms that Tanya talked about. And my job is to try to figure out, well, could this be COVID, you know, short, medium or long COVID? You know, I think there'll be, I think in time, it's a relatively, COVID is relatively new, and it takes time before we can actually tease out the various different subgroups, usually often in terms of treatment. But I think the most important thing is to listen to patients. A lot of patients, you know, because it's vague, sometimes there's a sense that, am I really being believed here? It's different if you've very hard physical signs, but if you've the more, I just feel fatigued, I can't think properly, I can't do my job. And it's not just the symptoms, it's the effect on their whole life. I can't work, I can't manage the kids, I just don't feel like going out. So we kind of try to focus on the whole person and try to tease out and see, you know, what is going on here, what might be due to the after effects of COVID, but what might be due to other things, because it's important that we don't get tunnel vision for COVID. Because the type of constellation of persisting symptoms that you get with COVID, a lot of those we have with other viral infections. You know, they're some of this stuff isn't new, and we do get people presenting with extreme fatigue. And, you know, we have a term called tired all the time. There's the patient who's that, and that I've been dealing with that for the last 30 years in general practice. And sometimes it's not always COVID. So listening. Active listening is really important, I think.
Yeah. Do you think that this might actually be something of a brighter vista in terms of post-viral fatigue syndrome being taken a bit more seriously and more research going into it? Nuala?
Well, you know, I think one of the fantastic things about COVID is, oh my God, look what we've achieved. Look what has been achieved in such a short period of time, because everybody worldwide has worked together. And yeah, I mean, if it means that the mechanisms, and there may well be, I mean, this isn't my area of expertise, I would bow to Karina and Mary on this, but there must, you know, at molecular level, there are, you know, similarities in some of these. And I think all of the research that's going to go into long COVID, I think may help other similar symptom complexes.
Liam, let's move on to this next question of why it is that some people end up suffering from long COVID and others don't. I'm going to prevail upon you to be modest, please, and hold off on your own research until perhaps we've talked through some of the other active theories. Some, like the one that suggests that there are wells of the virus that reside in certain organs and pop up again from time to time. What's the latest thinking on that?
There has been some very rare examples in the literature, of isolated individuals over a long period of time that the virus has been re-isolated from. But I have to say that with the attention that has been on this subject, I'm not impressed by the number of times that people have found this. So it seems to be quite rare that this can happen, at least for SARS-CoV-2. So, but as you know, it's really younger to older adults doesn't seem to make a difference too much. Perhaps more of a female risk factors are in there. It does seem to overlap a little bit with the group that will be more at risk from CFS, from chronic fatigue syndrome. And I guess we can come back to that in a little while when we talk about the mechanisms. So really for now, we don't know, but it could be very much involved with the microbiome, because this is really, don't forget, it's such a foundational component of who we are and how our body systems work. And none of us measures our microbiome right now when we're healthy, but you can have a microbiome that's a little bit off. And so that's one of the things that we're really looking at is, could there be components of the microbiome that would help us to protect against the acute infection, but also help to protect us and recover during a long COVID type of illness.
Okay, you didn't take long to get onto your own research, but I'll give you a free pass on that one. What is it that this early days research has established?
So it's still early days, as you said, but really I very strongly expect that we will be able to see a subgroup of patients. Again, as we've been saying, it's not everyone is the same, but there'll definitely be a subgroup of people whose microbiome is different compared to other people. And then the question would be, of course, is that a result of the disease, or did it contribute to you getting the disease? But that identification will really allow us to target a microbiome intervention and to really test, does it help to fix the immune system? Does it help to fix metabolism? Does it help to fix the neurological systems? So that's really the next steps that we need to get to.
And Karina, does this research indicate why it is that some people do and don't get long COVID, or why some people do and don't get serious COVID, asymptomatic COVID?
It's a good question, and I think it's too early to answer. There are some indications, I suppose, in terms of why people get serious COVID to begin with. The risk factors are well described in terms of, if people have underlying comorbidities, if men are more likely to get severe COVID, and in terms of why people get long COVID, as Liam has said, it may be that their immune system becomes hyperactivated almost, but as I said, we're very early on in establishing what the underlying mechanisms which are actually triggering long COVID are.
Okay, so look, with those caveats borne in mind, Liam, can you describe to us, please, what it is that if I was somebody with one of those immune systems that was more predisposed to giving me a serious case of COVID, what I might have noticed earlier on in my life, how I might have responded to other infections? Are there any commonalities there?
Really, that these are great questions, and they're the things that we still don't know, but we're very much actively investigating. One of the things, though, with launching this survey tonight that we really hope to discover is the answer to some of these questions. Who is it has got long COVID? Who is it, or what type of symptoms do you have? What mixtures do you have? What did you have before? What are you feeling now today? And it's exactly those kind of questions that we hope a lot of people answer, that we can begin to see, oh, such and such a group of people were more likely to have X, Y, Z previously. But we really don't know right now, Philip.
Tanya, do you want to weigh in on this? Because look, very often people get their own diagnoses badly wrong, but as Nuala will no doubt testify, people also know their own bodies and have good instincts as to what it is that is going wrong with them. Are there any, again, commonalities or insights that your group have shared as to why it is that they think that they ended up getting long COVID?
Again, an interesting question. I think a lot of us have discovered that we weren't listening to our bodies very well. Potentially in the female group who are working mothers, very busy people, often our health care needs go to the end of the list. And I think a lot of us in the group have discovered that our bodies were not in optimum health at the moment that we got the infection. So looking back retrospectively, probably we were deficient in vitamin D.
You don't mean comorbidities, do you, Tanya? You're talking about a sort of an underlying level of poor fitness or health.
Yes, and I think we don't give enough importance to something that often we just write off as in lifestyle, or we weren't as healthy as we could be. They have a massive impact on how your body deals with disease. So you, like me, had a very mild initial infection. I didn't have to be hospitalized whatsoever, and then have gone on to develop long COVID, and 18 months later, I'm still here. But I think within our group, what we're finding is that people are beginning to realize when looking at their bodies and really analyzing their symptoms, they're going, hey, wait a second, I wasn't really sleeping that well, and I may have had other issues. Maybe their nutrition wasn't optimum. Maybe they weren't exercising enough. And all of those things mean that your body wasn't, you know, at its peak 100 super fitness when you got hit with the disease, which microbiome will come into that probably as well, in that we don't habitually test our microbiome. It's a new area of science, but indications are that there may be a huge component to do with how you deal with the disease, or there is a large component with microbiome. So I think people are beginning to realize that they've got to get themselves as healthy as they can under the circumstances of long COVID, and then try to deal with all of the myriad of symptoms that they have. Because if you can at least get your body to the best health you can, well, then all boats will rise on a rising tide, as they say. But I think that'll help everybody.
Nuala, this is all very anecdotal and it might not be helpful, but again, can I put the same question to you? What have you seen that has impressed upon you as being the common experience of long COVID sufferers?
Well, I suppose there's two things in the discussion the last few minutes. First of all, in terms of getting severe COVID. So I think we do have to come back with what we know and what's unknown. And I think we have to be a little bit careful in dealing with both of those to ensure that we're always truthful and honest, and that we protect patients from perhaps trying treatments or going down pathways where, you know, we're not sure whether there's a benefit, and sometimes where there's not a benefit, there may be harm. So we've seen things like this with, you know, ivermectin being used for acute COVID. So I'm not for 1 minute suggesting anything to do with the microbiome being wrong, but I think we just have to be a little bit careful. So in terms of actually who gets severe COVID, the single most important risk factor is your age. The older you are, the more likely you are to get severe COVID. And if you combine that, and this has been studied very well, with certain comorbidities, which would be pre-existing cardiac disease, obesity, and diabetes, okay, and some lung conditions. They're the big things that are there. And it's interesting that it's in some of those systems as well that the long COVID comes. But you know, the long COVID can affect anybody. It doesn't quite make sense in some ways, because when you break them down, some of the people who have had very severe COVID, and so we know they may have actually had damage to their lungs or damage to the muscle of their heart. Or maybe they had, damage to part of their brain because there's a lot of clotting and thrombosis and strokes. So some of that can explain some of the sort of subgroups within, you know, that they're doing. But, you know, then you have other people who had the very mild, and then suddenly they present with myocarditis, which is essentially the heart is like a big muscle, and just the muscle stops working, and they're breathless, and they can't exercise and they can't walk. So I think we're at very early stages of trying to tease out why is it that one person gets long COVID or gets a particular kind of almost like a variation or a group of symptoms of long COVID, and some doesn't. This is particularly where you can do certain tests to make sure that they haven't actually, say, physically damaged the heart or the lungs from COVID. And then, of course, sometimes it just worsens maybe a pre-existing condition. You know, they may have already had a lung condition. So it's very complex. It's not easy to tease out. But I keep coming back to it, is that at the end of the day, we're treating a patient who's feeling unwell, who has symptoms, and it's all about how can we help them through that journey towards getting better? Because we do know that the vast majority of people will get better. It takes time, but they will get better. And hopefully over time, more specific treatments may emerge.
You have a very reassuring bedside manner. I want you as my GP, please. This next question might reveal, unfortunately, a little bit too much about the way that my mind works. But Liam, I'm fascinated about the research into the microbiome, into our flora and fauna in our gut at a point in time when people presumably had COVID. You were asking them for stool samples. That must have been, frankly, quite an unwelcome intrusion.
You know, this is one of the advantages of being a bench scientist. I didn't have to ask him, but Karina did. And it was the medical community were asking and collecting these samples. But, you know, this is all part of the normal workups that I hope in the future, you know, everyone who is ill, you know, has to subject themselves to as we learn more about the microbiome. And again, remember, half the cells in the human body are not human at all. They're bacterial. So and they're an integral part of how we digest our food, how we generate energy, how we regulate, you know, our defense against infections, you know, how we protect against overreacting to infections, and so on. So it's really an important part, I think, of the workup in the future that we would hope everybody will be subjecting themselves to, is the wrong word, but it'll be just part of, you know, getting a blood test and checking your nutrient levels, and you check your microbiome.
So unfortunately, it would seem that the answer to that second question that I posed at the beginning, why do some get it and others not, is that there is still so much that we don't know compared to what we do know. But we move on to discuss treatments here. And Karina Sadler, this is your moment to shine now. Before we discuss general treatments, have you got any information about what, if any, impact the vaccine is having on long COVID sufferers?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And there is anecdotal evidence and evidence actually emerging that people who are suffering from long COVID, that their symptoms improve. About 50% of people will report that their symptoms improve after the vaccine. As to why that happens, there's a huge amount of research ongoing into that, whether, you know, their immune system gets a boost and, you know, it helps clear viral reservoir, whether, I suppose we again, this is an unknown as to why that happens, but I suppose we're encouraging everyone to get the vaccine. So it's potentially another good reason to get the vaccine. And
that's a 50% improvement. Nobody's situation deteriorated, did it?
I mean, I suppose it's not reported that the vaccine is associated with any deterioration in someone with long COVID symptoms. But as I said, there is data emerging that it has the opposite effect, that people's symptoms improve. So that
okay.
is.
So it appears to be win-win there. Tanya, do you want to weigh in on that? What have your group said, or have you noticed or observed anything about the impact of vaccination on sufferers?
It's difficult, obviously, to speak for everybody in the group because there's such a range of experience. I mean, we have elite athletes in our group who had nothing wrong with them and who have long COVID, and everything in between. I think generally the vaccine has been well tolerated. There's been some worsening of symptoms slightly. Again, this long COVID is a kind of a waxing and waning often, where symptoms seem to get worse after a period maybe of stress, exercise, or for no reason at all. and then seems to settle back down again. Some people did have reactions to the vaccine, not terribly bad. They just had a slight worsening of symptoms, like a bad day or a couple of bad days, and then slowly they came back to their normal with long COVID. So there hasn't been any that I've seen massively bad reactions, and the vast majority of people have got the vaccine. I got it. I didn't seem to get any worse, and I certainly didn't get any massively better, but I'm happy that I'm protected.
Okay, back to you, Karina, then, please, and other kinds of treatment that are available here. And I appreciate that this is kind of as long as a piece of string question because of the subsets of different patients that we talked about earlier. So you can skim over it and be superficial if you want.
Yeah, so I guess it's important to say when we assess patients, we as Nuala said, of course, we look for medical causes of their symptoms as well. So obviously, if someone has evidence of end organ damage or an issue like myocarditis, and I should stress that these complications of COVID infection are extremely rare. So in the majority of patients with long COVID symptoms, these symptoms are medically unexplained. So, you know, there's no new treatment available for long COVID. There are clinical trials ongoing, but there is no medication to treat long COVID. There are medications that we use, of course, to alleviate patients' symptoms. And there are, I suppose, multidisciplinary team kind of interventions. So physiotherapy, occupational therapy, clinical psychology. You know, there are resources available to help patients manage their symptoms, but there is no, at the moment, there is no medication. Of course, there's lots of research ongoing, but we do need results from good quality randomized controlled trials before we start, you know, considering medication to treat long COVID, as in the broadest sense.
Okay, and what is being trialed? What have you read about that has most impressed upon you as being useful?
Yeah, so I suppose the research really is focusing on the mechanisms that may cause long COVID. So, you know, inflammation, you know, kind of autoantibodies, you know, clotting. So, you know, there are anti-inflammatory drugs they're looking at. They're looking at therapies that you know, act on the immune response, and there are antiviral therapies. But as I said, these are all in early stage randomized control trials, and, you know, until we have results from these studies, you know, there won't be any, I suppose, treatment prescribed until I suppose that there is proof that these medications work.
Liam, do you want to weigh in here on, well, number one, tell those that don't know what a fecal transplant is, and two, might it be useful in this scenario?
I very much doubt it, because I think these have to be a very targeted, you know.
Tell everybody what it is first.
So it's a transplant of a microbiome via someone's fecal sample from an otherwise healthy person. It has proved very successful in gastrointestinal infections like Clostridium difficile disease, which is caused by, you know, long-term use of antibiotics, which has otherwise killed all the microbiome that person has. So that microbiome in its entirety needs to be replaced. But in someone with long COVID or with acute COVID, or most of us, we have a microbiome. We're just perhaps missing parts of that microbiome, or there are parts that are not working well. So we need a much more targeted approach in that case. I don't think I would be advocating for FMTs for long COVID. But from a research point of view, I think that there's so much coming out now about acute COVID and about the immune system, about changes in metabolism, that is throwing up a whole new area of understanding for us around acute infection. The next round of studies will now be looking at, you know, patients with long COVID to see which ones of these systems, you know, may extend further than, or differences in these systems may extend further than just during the acute disease. So, and I think that's where, you know, we will really begin to understand, you know, some of the systems that, at least at a molecular level, don't really come back to their pre-COVID infection functioning.
Nuala, do you want to weigh in on that treatment question?
Yeah, there was the two things. First, was just a little bit just on the vaccines, because I think it's important if there's anyone there who still hasn't had their vaccine and is wondering about it, is that one of the things that we don't want to do is run the risk of getting a second episode of COVID because you don't have protection. And we so far. It seems that there's greater benefit to be had from having the vaccine than from not having the vaccine. And in terms of feeling unwell in the few days or even in a couple of weeks after the vaccine, many people, because I work in general practice, so I vaccinated hundreds of people, and loads of people have sore arms and fatigue and headache and all sorts of things for days and even to a couple of weeks afterwards. And I always say to people, that's really good. That means your immune system is mounting soldiers for when they meet the real thing and to fight that response. So that's just on the vaccines. And I think with treatments, so I suppose Queen is right. If there was sort of one specific treatment, so that you could take, and this reversed everything or treated everything to do with long COVID, that doesn't exist. But that doesn't exist for lots of things, and it didn't exist for lots of things. So take, for instance, something like multiple sclerosis. For most of the years of my practice, there was no specific treatment, and there was certainly nothing that could halt the progression of the disease. So just because there's no just one specific medical thing doesn't mean that there's not a whole load of other things that you can do to help people, because we know that people suffer. You were mentioning there, Tanya, about chest pressure and tightness. So learning how to rebreathe properly, working with a physiotherapist on trying to help. How can you help counteract those symptoms, like we've had to do with acute COVID? There are things that can help. Having a graduated exercise program because of the muscle damage and the fatigue that you're doing. How do you go about that? How do you gradually increase, working again with multidisciplinary teams? And then also dealing, I suppose, with the psychological fallout, which is apart at all from the brain fog. And there are exercises, there are things that people can be taught how to improve help with their concentration, even things like writing things down, reminders and stuff. But it's also, because it's had such an effect on your life, it's coping. And people experience anxiety because of that, and some people may get depressed. And I suppose it's coping with all of that and helping people. As I said before, it's all about trying to help people along that journey, which hopefully towards getting better. And I suppose one piece of information that I would like to share, because about long COVID, one of the longest studies in terms of following up patients who had long COVID. Now, these were hospitalized patients, and it was from Wuhan, and they looked at a hospital group, and at the 1 year mark, over 80% of the people were actually back in their normal jobs. So even though, yes, it's awful to have symptoms for more than 12 weeks, it's awful to have them for more than 3 weeks, but actually, as we go longer and longer, we can see that many more people will actually eventually recover from this. So there's positive things emerging as well, but our focus is always going to be about helping the patient along that journey, being careful that they don't start taking treatments or having maybe too much investigations that aren't necessary, and it's just something that we need to move along that path together, I suppose as patients, as health professionals, and as society as a whole.
You've moved the conversation pretty seamlessly in the direction that I wanted to lead us anyway, in talking about what support patients and researchers need at this point in time. Before we do that, let me just remind you here, as Michael, who is supporting us technically in this webinar this evening, has just pointed out. We're going to make a word cloud out of your questions, out of your submissions. He's just posted a link there in the chat. So it will be interesting to see when we put that word cloud together in a few minutes' time, what are the issues that are most pressing to you who are watching this evening. Tanya, onto that issue of support. What do patients need most right now?
I suppose it's really important to recognize that there isn't enough support. Firstly, it's been a challenge for a lot of people to be recognized that they had long COVID initially. Some patients are still getting gaslighted. Some people are written off that they're just anxious or depressed and nothing more. So I think it's important that the wider medical community, and this is down to the HSE mainly, that we have diagnostic guidelines to actually guide and help and support the medical profession to help and support patients better. In terms of what we as a patient group can access, your GP is your best port of call for acute symptoms of long COVID, because they will have access to send you off to a number of specialists, depending on the geography and the postcode lottery, the air code lottery, should I say. You might or may not have access to a long COVID clinic, which are multidisciplinary teams that will be able to send you down different pathways depending on your group of symptoms. And not only that, but they'll be able to, and I think the physio and the OTs are really important here, as well as the psychological supports. You know, when someone has been unable to do their normal life and they've had to completely adjust to a chronic long-term illness and all that that entails in terms of lifestyle curtailment, there's a massive mental toll. And most of those people are not getting access to the support that they need, whether it's, you know, for symptoms or for psychological and support groups. I mean, it would be remiss not to let people know that, I mean, ours is one group, Long COVID Ireland support group, and we have hundreds, almost thousands, I think, of people who are long COVID sufferers, and we support each other because, you know, sometimes others who are going through it are the ones who best understand. You don't need to explain the brain fog, the chronic fatigue. You can just go in and moan and everybody understands you. And that basic support is actually very, very valuable to a lot of people.
Karina, what are your thoughts on the idea of long COVID clinics all over the country? Is it helpful or is it unnecessarily unwieldy to set up a parallel system for what is ultimately the treatment of sick people?
It's a good question. I mean, clearly there are a large number of patients nationally that are suffering from long COVID. And we do have a long waiting list to be seen by a specialist or be seen in our clinic. You know, people being referred if there's clinical concern about a specific issue relating to their long COVID. Because the symptoms are so broad ranging, often they'll need to be seen by more than one specialist. They'll need a multidisciplinary team approach. And, you know, if there aren't, I suppose, long COVID multidisciplinary clinics, then, you know, an individual's care can be quite disjointed. So I think the idea of, you know, a multidisciplinary, you know, cross-specialty clinic would be very helpful for patients, you know, where they can get, you know, many issues addressed when they come in, you know, at the one appointment.
I trammeled you into quite a narrow question there. Can I ask you the broader question? What do you need in terms of support now at the coalface?
So, I mean, what we have and what is helpful, we have a specialist physiotherapist, and, you know, I think Nuala has very eloquently said we need to treat patients as individuals. And, you know, fatigue is a huge issue for patients that we're seeing. And, you know, exercise can sometimes exacerbate symptoms. So physiotherapists have, very good programs, individualized programs when they see these patients, and that they can work with them and monitor them. Similarly, OT, and from a psychological perspective and a clinical perspective, it's very important, I suppose, to, formally assess what level of function patients have, and to monitor that prospectively. So what we tend to see is patients' symptoms slowly get better, and Nuala has said that, but it tends to be very slow. They may not even notice it. For example, exercise tolerance, pulmonary function, but when you're objectively measuring these things at interval, the pattern is very slow improvement for the majority.
Liam, one of the things that has alarmed me, that I have seen quite a lot of in recent weeks, is research areas saying more research needed, but unfortunately we've run out of funding. So if I was to ask you the same question about what support it is that you need, are you going to be very reductive and just say money, or do you want to be a little bit more elaborate than that?
So I'd actually just like to make a comment first. From the type of research that we will do in the future, I think it is completely changing now, because, working with patients like Tanya, has completely changed how we're doing our research. So, in the past, I live in a world of molecules and cells, and I like to put them in their little boxes and, to make it all understandable. But Tanya will immediately, as she said tonight, tell me, but no, people have a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And I have to rechange how I do that then, that actually, it's not just one thing, it's many things. So just to give you an example, our research going forward will significantly improve by this interaction. And then regarding the funding, I think relatively speaking, we were incredibly fortunate here in Ireland with the level of funding and how rapidly we got funding from government agencies like Science Foundation Ireland to fund basically emergency studies, looking at the mechanisms and the consequences of the acute phase of the pandemic. But you are correct, these emergency fundings are now finishing, and we don't have any dedicated follow-on funding specifically for long COVID. And I would worry a little bit, you're right, that now when we go to fund long COVID research, it goes back into a common pot of research monies that everyone applies to do cancer research and all other types of research that's very important to do as well. So I guess maybe that's something that everyone who's listening here tonight, when you meet your local TD, please do advocate for research money specifically for long COVID, because I think it will absolutely be well spent, not just for long COVID, but also for other post-viral infectious issues that have been around for a long time, but just perhaps haven't got the attention that it has now.
Nuala, what do you want?
What I'd like about 500 more GPs for the country, because we've a desperate shortage of all sorts of people in the healthcare service, and that's difficulty with accessing. But I think for my patients who have these symptoms of COVID, if I could just take you through what I with the approach that I try to take, and obviously the first thing is listening to their symptoms, and there are a few simple tests that all GPs can do. So checking to make sure somebody's not anemic, that they're not deficient in a vitamin, that their thyroid gland is okay. And it can depend, because as I said, we must not have tunnel vision. Not everything that presents like this is actually COVID. And there may be something simple that we can do that will help to treating the anemia or sorting the thyroid function. Also, if they have already have a coexisting chronic disease, so maybe they have COPD, so the smoker's lung, and it may be that has been made worse by the COVID. So I may be looking at the type of inhalers that they're using, and there are different ones that I may be able to do. I can also get a chest X-ray on people. So then if I go down along the line where Karina, I'm wondering, is it the heart muscle, this myocarditis? I need a test called an echo, which is just a special examination of the heart. And as a GP in Ireland, I can't actually order that. So then I need to go through Queen. This is where the multidisciplinary clinic, where I could certain things. So I feel this patient they're breathless, we can put a little monitor on people. You know, we've seen these little oxygen things, and we can see when the exercise does it dip down, and that would be something that would worry me a little bit more. So then I might say, well, this patient needs to go, I definitely need some more respiratory investigations or some more.
Sorry, Nuala, can I interrupt you for 1 second? Are you saying that you still need to refer to cardiologists or to respiratory specialists before you can order a test that it is as plain as the nose on your face that is required?
Yes, but that's a whole other issue about access to diagnostics, and it is also subject to the postcode lottery. It's much better in some areas than others, but I suppose there's a certain amount that we can do. And one of the advantages of having this specialized or this multidisciplinary clinic that would be in the community, but it would be manned by the likes of Karina, who's ID, a respiratory, maybe a cardiac. Most importantly, the physios, the OTs, the psychologists who do a huge amount of the support work, is that rather than that patient, me sending them off to respiratory and they say, oh no, it's not my area, come back there. We could get it done more quickly, you know, to do that. And then you know, there may be a specific treatment once that has been told, but as Karina has said, people having actual damage to those parts of their body system, they're a small portion. It's more the chronic fatigue, the brain fog, maybe the sort of the palpitations, there's that whole, I suppose, soft is not that they mean that they're not very real symptoms, but they affect lots of different areas. That's where you need all the supports in terms of the graduated exercise program, the OT program, the psychological support, basically helping people to how can I best continue and get on with my life while hopefully my body recovers by itself from this debilitating post-COVID.
Okay, I'm going to step aside at this point because I'm sure you've heard quite enough of my clumsy questions, and it's time to actually get Mary to put some of your questions to the panel. Just before I do, oh, Karina, you wanted to say something? Are you putting your hand up, or are you just waving to the audience generally? All right. Tanya, how do people find the Long COVID Ireland support group?
So if they go onto Facebook and plug in Long COVID Ireland support group, they'll come up, and it's a closed group, so it's a safe space. You have to answer a couple of questions before you're admitted, and people agree to the rules of the group. And that's a quick and easy way. We also have a Twitter account if you look for us on their Long COVID Ireland support. And I suppose one of the things that I'd like to echo in terms of what Liam said earlier, I'm the one who's always going, but what about, I'm always questioning the patient perspective, I suppose, in anything that's being planned. We know a lot about long COVID. We know a lot from other jurisdictions. Other countries have diagnostic guidelines like the UK, who are not, you know, totally different genetically from us by any manner of means. We still don't have them in Ireland. And so there's a few barriers that are bureaucratic that are preventing maybe better access and better information. But there are huge, huge strides being made in terms of research, and the cooperation, which is a totally new departure, as I understand it, for the way that it works in Ireland, that patients are at the centre of what needs to happen going forward in terms of research and supports. So I hope that this may be a model for looking at the whole person and the whole organism in any disease, not just long COVID, but there's a whole bunch of diseases that would benefit from this approach. And hopefully this is kind of a line in the sand in terms of this actually multidisciplinary approach is the way, the future really.
Okay, very good. Now, before we hand over to Mary and the questions, let us take a look at the word cloud. And let me just, before we do, say I have done these kind of events before where people have managed to successfully game word clouds to their agenda by putting in the same question with the same words repeatedly. So with that health warning in mind, Michael, if you want to pop it up there, we'll see, does this reflect, how does it reflect your concerns? Fatigue and frustration, the two key things leaping out of that. And oh Lord, bleakness. imaginary. I mean, imaginary is probably a reflection of people being told this is all in your imagination. Profound fatigue, exhaustion, fear of the unknown, medical gaslighting. There's a lot of things reflecting the same two basic things there in those questions. All right, we want to get into the questions in a good deal more detail. Mary, do you want to take us through them, please?
Thanks, Philip, for really stimulating discussion with my colleagues. I'm going to start off by asking a question, a common theme that came in. I'll start off with Liam. Liam, all our immune systems are different. We know that from diseases we get or the effect diseases have on some people, and with a kind of spectrum from mild to very severe. How do you factor that in when it comes to, you know, infection and the impact it has on a particular disease? Because when we measure inflammatory response, we're really doing with very crude tools and not with what you can do in the laboratory. Because sometimes, and you see the frustration, people not being believed, when certainly I was from a clinical point of view, and Nuala and Karina would say that, is that, you know, people genuinely have symptoms. It's hard for us as doctors to say, this test is positive, so you clearly have something. So where are we at with really measuring micro-inflammatory responses so we can explain to patients what they have, because sometimes that certainty makes it much easier for them to comprehend.
That's exactly what I hope we can do in much more detail in the very near future. So from a research point of view, we're doing this, as you know, instead of just looking at the inflammatory mediators that we know is causing or resulting from the damage that has happened, we're actually looking at the mediators that are controlling the whole show. And so the technology is there, the knowledge is there. To my mind, it's more of a question of investment. These tests are not cheap. Typically, for each of the patients in our research that we looked at 50 of these controlling mediators, it probably costs close to €1,000 each for just to buy the kits to run those assays. But the amount of data we get back is incredible, and it is different for different people. So again, moving forward into the future, that more detailed look at the individual, not just the macro look, but also the micro look at the individual components of that person's immune system and which part of that immune system is overreacting or not functioning correctly or has been damaged because of something else in the past. That's absolutely, it has to be the way forward.
And I suppose a question for Karina, and it's a really common theme and the questions that are coming in. The person is previously healthy, very loads of, well able to be active, often, doing certainly a lot more than I would normally do. And all of a sudden they go from 100 to 0. How do you help, given that, there isn't clearly a therapy at the moment, or a medication, because that's what we normally grab. Like, how do you support people to try to get back to their baseline? They may not get fully back to their baseline, but they may have a graded approach to it. Like, what's your plan?
Yeah, so it's a good point. A lot of what we're doing in the clinic is actually validating the long COVID diagnosis, and I suppose reassuring people, where investigations were required to outrule an underlying organic pathology, that there's nothing sinister going on. And, once they have a diagnosis of long COVID, then we're working from there, very simple things, like, a good diet, plenty of rest. A common thing we see is, as you said, particularly in young, very fit people, that they're impatient. They want to get back to, running 10 kilometers a week, and they maybe, approach things too quickly. We're finding that that recovery needs to be very gradual, that they need to pace themselves. I would say, because I do appreciate people are waiting quite a long time to come to our clinics, there are some as well as the peer-to-peer support, there are some very good self-education websites online, and the Irish Society of Chartered Physiotherapists launched an online COVID hub this month, and there's really good resources there in terms of managing fatigue, physical fatigue, mental fatigue, and you know, in terms of activity and how to pace oneself, particularly those who get negative feedback from exercising. So, you know, the research is ongoing, and I suppose data is emerging on how these, I suppose, therapies can help, particularly while they're waiting to be seen by the specialist team.
Green, I'm going to ask you another question before I move over to questions with Nuala. Part of our job as doctors is to advocate for the needs of our patients, whether it's the population group or individual patients. But what is, like, from a long COVID point of view, I know there are some clinics up in Dublin, often very well resourced. Dublin's often more resourced. Obviously, the population is bigger. But what can we do as a medical community to advocate it for the national clinical programs through infectious diseases, and really, you know, be the voice of the patient that we're hearing from in the chat and the questions?
Yeah, I think really the survey that we're launching this evening with Tanya, it will look to address this, Mary. I really think we need to gather data. You know, I'm saying anecdotally, I'm seeing this number of patients in clinic. You know, I think we need to collect data. We need to show where the resources are needed. And, you know, I suppose if we look at models in the UK and internationally, and even, as you said, the postcode lottery, you know, there needs to be, you know, equitable access to these resources for patients nationally. And really that's what we want to see. We want to be able to deliver the best care for these patients.
So having the information through the survey really will help. I suppose you have a tool to advocate for what's really an important service, because one of the people listening in is from the West and really has had, you know, there's no resources there to support her. So just to comment on that, I'm going to move over to Nuala, because there are quite a number of questions from a GP perspective. I'm going to ask you about children secondly, but firstly, the ICGP developing guidelines, very much like they did over in the UK. Can we get those done vis-a-vis what supports that you can give, what tests need to be done, so that there's a standardized approach in as much as possible to supporting those with prolonged COVID symptoms?
Well, the college has already done educational webinars for the GPs, Mary. As you know, we've been doing educational webinars every Wednesday night. So we've actually had 3 on long COVID, and there's another one planned by Professor Susan Smith, sort of updating as we go along, and taking through, and so that GPs, we get over 2,000 GPs online every Wednesday night, and have done since March of 2020, and so we've been doing that, and it's very helpful, and Susan is doing that again. But the other thing is, we have in the college have advocated very strongly about having equitable access to multidisciplinary clinics. I am part of the Irish College of General Practitioners and the Irish Medical Organisation HSE liaison group, and we meet with the HSE every week. And this has been one of the things, and I do know, I think they're actually about to launch their framework. They have a model, there's a model of care and a framework, which is looking at how these services can be organised nationally. And I know that is imminently due to actually be released. So I think that will be very helpful in trying to plan for the future.
And Nuala, you see much more children than we do professionally. And I know there was a recent paper out showing that the long COVID was really uncommon in children and adolescents. Do you have any comments on your experience in dealing with children?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I personally, I haven't any children in our practice, and we've a large practice. We've actually 10 GPs in our practice, so it's one of the largest practices in Cork City, so we haven't had any experience of children as such with long COVID. Thankfully, and I think internationally, while yes, there are some children experiencing long COVID or experiencing this multi-system inflammatory disorder, thankfully, it doesn't appear that long COVID is very common in children. And the other thing is that with the vaccination, I noticed in one of the comments, someone was saying that she'd been vaccinated and yet she still got long COVID. And yes, you can. But actually, there's just a recent study published that there's at least a 50% reduction in the risk of getting long COVID if you've actually been fully vaccinated. So again, that's more reassuring news for the general population, because as we know, the vaccine isn't 100% protective and we are getting breakthrough milder infections.
And there's a question for Liam with regard to probiotics and their use or benefit or otherwise in managing long COVID.
So there's no clinical study has been done so far, at least that I'm aware of. So we definitely can't recommend that any single specific probiotic will be useful for long COVID. But in general, probiotics are good for people. And so I wouldn't stop people taking them. And my advice would be, take one for a while, see how you get on. If it doesn't make any difference, that's okay. But, it won't do you any harm. So unfortunately, we can't make any specific recommendation for any specific probiotics right now.
Okay, I'm really conscious that I'm leaving Tanya out of the questions. It's just a lot of them are medical and about immunity, but I suppose I can ask you about work you're doing with Karina on, really advocating for clinic in CUH, and one of the questions is the clinic in CUH for just people who were admitted with COVID in CUH or not. And I'm conscious that there are people outside Cork. Sorry, my light flickers here. Karina, do you want to talk maybe about that, and Tanya can comment?
So I suppose initially the focus was obviously on the patients who were hospitalized with COVID, but as time has gone on, we are seeing referrals with long COVID in patients who had mild initial illness who weren't hospitalized. Now, that said, that these patients are being seen within the existing resource. We currently have a single consultant in CUH. So there are long waiting lists. There are a large number of consultant posts which remain unfilled in CUH and nationally. We know waiting lists, I suppose we're seeing patients who have other issues with other infections also. So, all these things, I suppose, compound the waiting times for patients with long COVID. But in short, the answer is yes, the waiting lists are long, unfortunately.
Tanya, do you want to comment at all?
I think, look, unfortunately, the resources that are there in Ireland, we are all too well aware, are woefully inadequate. But I think there's a lot we can do to help ourselves. First of all, get a bit of a support network going, whether it's your family, friends, co-workers, or Facebook long COVID support group, and learn more about the disease. I think this is where we do, as patients, need to actually learn as much as we can to help ourselves. So things like rest. I cannot underestimate the significance of pacing and rest for a patient that is ill. Liam and I spoke a couple of weeks ago when we were doing a press photo shoot about how there were sanatoriums in Switzerland and in Ireland and many other places a long time ago, where people, after they had a serious illness, went to rest and recover. Now, unfortunately, in our modern lives, that isn't really an option for many of us. But the idea of that is actually really important. And although there may not be a double-blind clinical study, there's hundreds of years of clinical experience that says you need to let your body rest to recover. So if, as Karina was saying earlier on, if you don't tolerate even the vaguest amount of exercise, which I don't, for example, I'm totally out of breath because I walked to the end of the garden 3 times with the dog today, then you need to learn to pace yourself and not do too much, because it can set you back. And that's where, you know, a bit of data, bit of your own data. How do you sleep? How is your diet? Is it the best that it can be? Bringing that information to the GP, that's something that I can say really helps every GP. I hope the medical profession will agree with me. But if you can have a symptom diary, if you can explain, because literally with the brain fog, half the time you don't even know what symptoms that you remember. So noting it down and giving those to the GP will really help them in terms of sending you in the right path as well. And taking as much time to allow your body to recover as possible. And I know that sounds really trite, but actually sometimes we don't do that. And it's unfortunate because a lot of people still have to work and they come home and collapse every evening and every weekend and they have no choice around it. But you just have to farm out any work or physical exertion that you can to other people in order to let your body recover.
Thanks, Tanya. Nuala, do you have, you know, from your webinar, ICGP webinars, do you have any idea of the numbers of people with long COVID? A few questions came in that way.
The numbers of people in Ireland.
Yeah.
No, I do know that there has been some analysis done, which hasn't been published on that. So they're trying to look at the numbers based on the number of cases that we've had with COVID. I knew there's a group looking at that, the numbers that were hospitalized, and then looking at a time series over time to try and judge. If you look at the UK National Statistics Office, they're talking about 1.5% of the population in the UK report symptoms. So that's 945,000 people in the UK. So I suppose 1.5% of our population, I can't do the math on that. Someone with the math set might do that. But I do know that there's been a group trying to determine that, but and that hopefully then you know, that it obviously it will diminish over time. But you know, I think Tanya is so important, Tanya, what you said about writing down the symptoms, and it's very helpful with us that we know the symptoms and know, yes, is this the patient that I definitely need to try to push to get that echo or that cardiac MRI or the specialist investigations. That's part of the thing that it does, but also to try to direct the patient and refer them to the most appropriate support services for them as well.
Karina, there are a number of questions in about people having unusual symptoms, ongoing pins and needles, as one example. And also, you know, what I'd call reactivation of EBV, probably positive serology that's there, positive ANA. To me, they're all indicators of underlying triggers of inflammation. Do you want to just comment on certainly the blood tests, but also some unusual symptoms, including somebody dysautonomia, which is basically a dysregulation of your ability to control blood pressure and things like that. Do you want to just comment on that?
I suppose I'll talk about the I suppose autonomic dysfunction. I'll just address that first. We do have a neurophysiologist who specializes in this in CUH. So you know, I suppose your autonomic system controls many of the things like, for example, sweating, your blood pressure, things that you can't consciously control. We know that COVID affects your olfactory nerve, so your sense of smell, and you know, there are theories that it can affect your vagus nerve. You know, that people will get autonomic dysfunction. You know, and that is you know, an area of research. It is a pathway of referral, and there are certainly techniques you know, to address these symptoms, and they sometimes can present as kind of vague symptoms, you know, abnormal palpitations where there is no underlying medical cause identified. And then in relation to the blood tests, it's difficult to know. 10% of the population will have a reactive ANA. If there isn't a, these tests, I suppose, need to be interpreted in a clinical context. And we often see reactive antibodies, reactive serologies, and they're not, I suppose, the point being that they really need to be interpreted in the context of clinical symptoms and particular presentation.
But there may be a flag for something that's going on that we as doctors certainly don't have the answers to everything, and we learn that with time. There's a question, and I suppose for Nuala really, following on Tanya's observation, the use one person has used digital tracker, Garmin and Apple, just to kind of motivate. I mean, they're good motivators for exercise and getting all of us up and running. Do you think they're a useful tool for people to from a movement point of view with long COVID?
I think that sometimes it's a way of tracking your progress as well. Because as Karina was saying there, that sometimes the pace of improvement is so slow, it can be hard. It's sometimes nice to have an objective. I think it would be nice to have a nice kind of a questionnaire, or for people to try to even document themselves, well, what would get better? So Tanya, you were saying you walked up and down the garden 3 times. So progress is going to be, well, I can do it 4 times. And it's small things like that you set yourself little goals and that you can track. Be that it doesn't have, you don't have to have a fancy Garmin, I suppose, to do that. You can still track yourself and set yourself small little goals. They don't, I mean, a few people are saying, oh, why are you recommending exercise? We feel worse after exercise. It's a graduated exercise program, because if you don't actually exercise or start to move at all, then your muscles decondition, and then that's harder to get going. So that's why I think the help of an occupational therapist and a physiotherapist, that multidisciplinary support that's used to helping people to recover, who've had perhaps more defined type of illnesses, from a road traffic accident where they broke stuff or their lungs punctured. So there we have expertise within allied health professionals that is really used and is very skilled at helping people to recover from illnesses. And I think it's that broader approach that I think most people will see the benefit from, because there's a few people who are talking about very specific treatments inside there too, Mary. And some of the ones, I'm just not sure that the evidence is there for them. Somebody's been put on azithromycin prophylaxis, which is an antibiotic for 6 months. And I'm not sure who it's by. I can see perhaps where the theory might come from, because we sometimes do use it for people who have COPD, particular types of COPD, who've had a particular number of hospital admissions. Sometimes it's something that we use for its anti-inflammatory effect, but as far as I'm aware anyway, there's no evidence of benefit for that in long COVID. And I suppose that's the kind of thing, I just be wary that things might start to, because there isn't, when there's a vacuum. And I mean, we're being open and honest. We're saying, yes, we're trying to learn all the time, but we don't have specific treatments. We have things that will help with the symptoms. So, but we also need to be careful to protect patients from using treatments that could potentially do harm.
Yeah. And I see in the chat box our colleague, Professor Joe McVeigh, who heads the Department of Physiotherapy in UCC, one group of healthcare professionals that have been absolutely under-recognised for the work they've done during COVID, not only with this part of it where trying to exercise and get people back to their baseline, but the amount of work they did and continue to do in the hospitals, preventing people from getting into the ICU. I have to mention them because that was our experience on the front line. I can tell you our ICUs would have had bunk beds if it wasn't for the physiotherapists. And I think they're a group that are undervalued underutilized and certainly have a place in this. I suppose I'm going to start wrapping up. I think it's really important for the attendees to understand that doctors and scientists don't have the answer to all of the questions now. And I certainly, from my experience as an infectious disease doctor for the last 30 years, I constantly see people who've had a viral trigger, or it's usually an infection trigger, that causes symptoms that are life-changing. From my experience, a lot of those are reversible, and that the prognosis is better long-term. I think what COVID will teach us is we will have more science on explaining that those inflammatory responses that are triggered by viruses, in my opinion, generally, that will help us not only understand COVID and long COVID, but also things post-Epstein-Barr, post-Lyme disease, just as examples, and that by you helping us to understand that better, we will be able to understand and communicate how we can better treat and support those without obvious. Just because your test is normal doesn't mean you haven't anything, and I think that absolutely needs to be an reassuring point. And I'm sure I see Nuala smiling there, because that's our experience on the front line as doctors who are experienced in the area. And Nuala, you might want to have a final comment on your years of experience, like myself.
Yeah, I said one of the things is that we have to be honest with patients, honest about what we know, what we don't know. We have to listen, and at all times our goal is to try to help you on the journey, hopefully towards full recovery, but if not, towards getting back to being as good as you can be, and keeping an eye on all of the new research that's coming out that may be there to help people with long COVID.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Nuala. I'm just going to remind everyone that there will be a survey link put in the chat function. I presume that's been there, Michael. I'm trusting you with the technology. It's not my forte. And if you can email with the survey link, which will be circulated afterwards. I think Paul had said that it would be afterwards. I'm going to close up by firstly thanking everybody in APC who organised everything in the background, to Paul Ross and his team, who continue to contribute hugely to our knowledge of COVID-19 as well as many other diseases. There are loads of other diseases out there that they've helped support. In particular, also Tina Darb and Michael Keller, who keeps me on track, and Mark McCarthy, to the panel, of course, and to Philip Boucher-Hayes, who seamlessly conducted the discussion, facilitated the discussion. So look, I hope we don't have any rapid answers, but we only can learn the answers from the likes of Tanya, and those of you who are in. We have to listen to you, we have to learn from you, and by doing that we can make things better through science and research. So with that, I'll close the meeting. Again, really will be helpful to answer the survey, not only giving us information, but able to advocate on your behalf. And Karina will be leading, and Liam from a UCC and clinical point of view on this. So thank you for all your work on this.